COVID, in a sense, for all of us, was this massive experiment in constraint-driven innovation.
Hello and welcome to Google Firestarters. I'm Neil Perkin, the host of Think with Google Firestarters. And this is a series of insightful conversations in which we dive into the most interesting and interested topics and people in the advertising, marketing and strategy industry. And today's guest is both interesting and interested. I'm delighted to welcome Adam Morgan, who is the founder and partner of eatbigfish, who wrote the seminal Eating the Big Fish and popularized the term challenger brand. And he also wrote the brilliant Pirate Inside and also A Beautiful Constraint. So I'm going to dive straight into your provocation, Adam, if I may. But welcome to Firestarters. And let me start by asking, what is your provocation for the Firestarters audience?
My provocation is this, really, that constraints have a bad rap. If we were to free associate between the two of us about what constraints meant, they would be negative things. They would be the sense that it limits us in some ways, it prevents us from achieving our full potential, it's restrictive, it's therefore bad. And then actually the reality is very often constraints are a stimulus to better. And that we need to start seeing them in that way, that we understand that in some parts of our life. Those of us that play sport understand the constraints around the sport are the thing that makes it interesting. Those of us that are parents understand that the constraints we put around our children are the things that stops them from turning into little monsters. But we're not applying that more broadly to other areas of our business or indeed kind of human life. So that's the first part. The second thing is that, therefore, I would like us to reclaim inventiveness. Inventiveness has become a rather old-fashioned term. But if we take inventiveness to mean the ability to find the opportunity in a constraint, you could argue, couldn't you, that actually our ability to be inventive and be inventive successfully is going to be as important as innovation to our success as human beings, business people, citizens of the planet. And perhaps there's a third part of that provocation, that actually inventiveness is really simply a series of strategies. And what A Beautiful Constraint tries to do is just look at what some of those strategies might be. So say this is replicable and learnable. It's not nature, this is nurture. And therefore we can all have it.
So you mentioned in the book actually about the idea of a kind of transformer mindset rather than the sort of neutralizer mindset. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so the book was really, you write yourself, you know what happens is you kind of develop a hypothesis and then you take it out into the interviews. And so we developed this view that actually some people were naturally transformers. Some people were just really good at finding the opportunity constraint and some people weren't. And we called them victims. And by a victim, we meant someone who reduces their ambition to fit the constraint. Oh, well, I was supposed to sell 3,000 widgets with a budget of X. You've halved my budget. I can only sell half that amount of widgets. So they were victim to that constraint. So we had this view that there were some people who were really good as transformers. And so we went out to interview some of those transformers. And about the second person we interviewed was a guy called Michael Beirut, who's a kind of rock star designer at Pentagram in New York, and who's a very creative thinker, spends all day, every day thinking about creative solutions. And I outlined this rather crude hypothesis to him, and he said, "I think you've got that wrong." He said, "I do this all the time for my clients, and every time I am faced with a brief with a significant constraint in is I think, how the hell am I supposed to solve this? I feel like a victim." It's a very natural first stage to go through. And then, I get very grumpy and I stomp around a bit. And then after a couple of days, we get together the team, think, hang on, maybe there's a way through this. And then sure enough, we start to look at sort of different kinds of solution field and work with different kinds of people and interrogate different kinds of questions. We get to a much better answer. He said, I think that actually these are 3 stages that you go through. You always start in the victim stage, and then you have your job, Adam and Mark, my co-author Mark, in San Francisco, is to kind of help people through a number of strategic nudges, if you like, get them over to think more transformatively about it. If you talk to kind of cognitive scientists about this kind of transformative process, they talk about people who process things kind of quite sort of tactically and process them more globally. So sometimes the sheer nature of the constraint is so difficult, it forces you to step back completely and have a much more sort of distanced view of the relationship between the constraint and the ambition. And that allows you to see connections that perhaps when you were closer, you couldn't actually see. So there's quite a lot that goes in that kind of transformative stage and approach that is enormously beneficial if we can nudge ourselves into seeing it that way.
One of the things that resonated with me actually was about this idea of combining a bold ambition with a kind of significant constraint of some kind, and how that can actually take you outside of your kind of normal thinking. So in other words, you're avoiding the kind of path dependence that companies and teams sometimes get into. And that's really interesting, because I talk a lot to teams about how you can not be path dependent and avoid that kind of same kind of thing. But why do you think it is that companies and teams get path dependent in the first place?
I think it's because of the drive to efficiency, isn't it, really? If in a world where efficiency and productivity is so prized, and for all that the world talks about innovation, there's very little acceptance that innovation is inherently inefficient. So the desire to kind of do more with the time that we have is kind of part of the kind of the burden. And you can see actually when people sometimes, I remember sitting in a large kind of European confectionery conference, and the president of the business was talking to the business and saying, basically, for the next 2 or 3 years, you have to get much better at doing more with less. And you could see that the people in the front row and the second row and the third row had no idea what that meant, other than I'll have to work a bit harder on Tuesday night then. So what I like about the idea of kind of coupling the propelling question, which is the question that has the big ambition and the significant constraint at the same time, is it's a way of actually saying, let's be realistic about the constraints that we face. And let's actually, instead of avoiding them, because listen, I spent an awful lot of my time facilitating innovation sessions or blue sky thinking sessions where you said, let's take all the constraints out of the room, right? Let's imagine we can do whatever we want to do, and you have this fantastic day generating ideas. And then, of course, the constraints come back into the room, and then all 98% of those things wither and die on the wall. So it's has really kind of changed my way of thinking about it, actually, that if we put the constraint in conjunction with the big ambition and make sure it is a big ambition, you get actually very productively uncomfortable. So again, if you talk to the cognitive scientists, they say your brain gets productively uncomfortable because those two things shouldn't belong together. So it forces the brain to interrogate your underlying assumptions about the relationships between those two things. And I'm really interested by leaders who deliberately, not to just have those things forced on them, but deliberately put those kinds of propelling questions in front of their teams, because they feel that actually that's going to get them to a more productive answer. So my favorite example of this is I was doing a project with Audi of America a while ago. And I was at it was fantastic. It was with the dealers. We were in Napa, in a winery in Napa. It's one of the kind of glorious kind of Californian lunchtimes, sitting outside. And one of the dealers next to me gets talking about Audi re-entering Le Mans in the noughties. It's about 2006 or 7, I think, and they had to design a new car for it. And he said it was very interesting because the chief designer stood up in front of the design team, who were probably like 35 people, trying to design this car. And he said, well, the natural brief for us is going to be about something that makes the car go faster. But he said, we're progressive, right? Audi is all about being progressive. That's what's written over the factory gates in Germany. So that's not a progressive question. The more progressive question is, this is what we're going to work against. How can we win Le Mans with a car that is no faster than anybody else's? So big ambition, win Le Mans, no faster than anybody else's. And to your point about path dependence, I guarantee all of the designers in that room must have thought, well, this is not what my CV has prepared me for, right? I've been working in wind tunnels. I've been working with kind of carbon fiber. I've been working on how to make cars go faster. That's what's got me promoted. That's what means. That's why I'm sitting in this chair in this room. And now you're giving me a question which actually none of that appears to be relevant to in the same kind of way. How am I supposed to answer that? And that's the point about feeling like a victim that Michael Beirut makes, which is initially you're going to think, okay, this is difficult. And in fact, one of the other guys I interviewed, Colin Kelly from Warburton's, he said, he made the point that it's very easy to put up your hand to answer a question you already know how to answer. It's much harder to put up your hand to answer a question you don't know how to answer. And that's one that breaks with path dependence, because everything I've done has not enabled me to answer that question. So I love leaders putting those kinds of questions in front of their teams. And in the case of Audi, what it led them to, of course, was to use diesel technology in long distance racing for the first time, which made them more fuel efficient, which means they didn't have to put in the pits as often, so they could stay on the track with the same speed car, put in the pits less often, and they won them all 1, 2, 3 on the podium the next 3 years. So I think that's really interesting. And if you look at Harvard Business Review does these little kind of summation of the best articles about leadership, these little orange books, 10 best articles about leadership. And I bought one a couple of years ago at an airport in New York and just skimmed it to see how often the word constraint came up in the 10 best articles about leadership. Didn't come up once. It was as if constraints were not involved in leadership at all, and leadership was entirely without constraints. And yet, I imagine you and I would say, surely the acid test of leadership from now on, or the next 10 years, is going to be, how do we help our teams manage constraints beautifully? That's going to be one of the acid tests, whether it's of resource or finance or innovation or whatever it happens to be. That's going to be a key test.
I love that Audi example. That's brilliant. If people are asking can-if questions, is that a way of actually understanding exactly what you need to do in order to make this possible when it might not be possible right now?
So the can-if idea was actually by Colin Kelly of Warburton's, who was the chief technical officer of Warburton's at the time, and was effectively looking to kind of reinvent the bread making process. And he's a very interesting guy. He'd worked at Heinz beforehand in Russia, had all sorts of kind of supply chain constraint issues. So he'd had to be quite inventive. And he said this very simple thing, which is, when I'm working with my team and we're facing this very difficult challenge, a propelling question, as it were, they have to start the sentence, we can do that if. They can't start the sentence, we can't do that because. And I loved it because obviously it keeps all the energy in the right conversation, which is how do we solve this, however laterally we need to think, or however implausible initially the solution might be, rather than allowing us to drift into a second question, which is this question that can be solved. And I think, to your point, one of the things that it's partly about how possible it is or not. It's partly also because I think in a lot of situations, people double guess what the leadership will and won't buy. They talk themselves out of suggesting a possible solution because they think, oh, well, Neil, the CEO, he'll never buy that. So we don't even suggest it. And actually, by and large, if you then talk to the CEO, you then interview Neil about it, Neil says, I wish I was asked to say no more often. So there's this strange disconnect between the kind of the culture, between the people who really want to make stuff happen and the perceived blocker to that, who doesn't want to be a blocker at all, who thinks actually it's perfectly possible. So that's another part of it too. I often think these solutions are much more real and much more possible than people think they are. They just need to be given permission through some kind of trigger like that to voice it. And then once it's in the room, then actually you can start to talk about it and think about it. It's okay to think about and talk about.
And I'd like also to just ask a bit about context and application. So it feels now, with this kind of overabundance of choice that we've got with and connections, but also the kind of scarcity of time that people have, and also scarcity of resources, particularly in the current context. Is this an idea really which has much more relevance now because of the situation that we're in now with economic challenges and so on?
I do think that, actually, and I think it's my partner Mark worked a lot with Nike, and I think that he sort of traced with sort of insiders within Nike the kind of journey of Nike through this, where they started off in the 90s, obviously being on the back foot because people were lobbying them against using gases in their shoes, for instance, that they shouldn't be using, and using too much material, and sweatshops in Asia and that kind of stuff. And their initial response was as a victim, right? It was denial. No, this isn't our problem. We're just responsible for making shoes for athletes. And then gradually they recognized that they had to face into it and started to respond to pressure. Only to now, they now got to the stage where actually with things like the Flyknit shoe and with waterless dyeing, they are actually looking for constraints themselves in line with the kinds of environmental constraints we all need to lean into. And by leaning into those constraints early, doing two interesting things. So one is it's forcing them to think about what they call pre-competitive spaces. So with waterless dyeing, they team up with Adidas, as you probably know, to say, this is so important for the world that we solve it. Let's put our competitive differences aside at this early stage. will then both commit to this particular technology, and then clearly gloves are off when we get a bit further down the line, we're selling the shoes. That's really interesting in terms of what that constraint has forced them to think about for the good of the world as a whole. And secondly, they now see it as a source of competitive advantage. By imposing these constraints on ourselves, we can make breakthroughs and get ahead of our competitors. So I absolutely do think it's of the time. And COVID, in a sense, for all of us, was this massive experiment in constraint-driven innovation. And now, just very crudely, take the most obvious example, that hybrid working is being driven by the realization that from that constraint came this enormous unexpected benefit, which is I can be a good parent and put in a good shift at work, both at the same time. These are not actually quite the fork in the road that I thought they were, and that's why people don't want to come back to work in the same kind of way. So the other thing I love about constraint-driven benefits is very often there's unexpected benefit in addition to the thing you thought you were going to solve for, which is we need to get all the team together somehow, even though they can't come out of their houses. Unexpected benefits show up, which are enormously exciting, I think, for us.
I'm also keen to ask actually about whether you have any examples of this kind of thinking being applied outside of corporate world, maybe.
Yeah, well, yes, okay. So I mean, one of the things I'm delighted about it, and you know this again as an author, one of the things that's pleasurable about writing books is it's kind of like launching lots of little sort of messages in bottles, and you don't know who's doing with them. And occasionally, you get a bottle back, and somebody says, "Look, here's what I've done with it." So we thought something interesting was happening quite early on, when besides taking quite big companies through it in their entirety. So Mark was invited into San Quentin prison to go and talk to long-term inmates about making constraints beautiful, because they wanted to, when they left, they were going to come out. They wanted to become entrepreneurs, but had been denied technology for obvious reasons for quite a long period of time. So that's kind of interesting. I find it very addictive, and I basically, a beautiful constraint is just a quilting bee of other people's ideas that Mark and I stitched together. So I'm not claiming any credit for it, but I've found it very addictive as a philosophy of life, and I'm very much apply it to my own life as well now. And once you start seeing the world like that, as I say, it's intoxicating as well as important, I think.
Fabulous. And I've got one last question, if I may, which is just really going back to that point you made about inventiveness. And one thing I've seen you say as well is about the need for brands, in particular, taking it back to marketing, to be more inventive, I suppose, and to be more interesting, actually. So just tell me a little bit about that.
Yes, so I think it's quite striking, isn't it, that, I mean, I've been in business a long time, so I started in advertising in the early 80s. And in all that time, for all the apparent progress that we've made as marketers in understanding how to grow our businesses and how to grow our brands, the reality is that brands and marketing are just as dull as they always were, and that actually Cannes is a complete anomaly that we look at too much, because the reality of what's around us is pretty depressingly mundane. Strategically, it is imperative on us to make what we do more interesting. So my next project is to go off and interview people whose jobs it is to make dull subjects interesting. So let's look at teachers. Obviously, teachers need two primary skills. One is behavior management. I've got to keep everybody in their place and listening. And the second thing is I've got to make polynomial equations interesting to the kids at the back of the room who basically want to kind of text the rest of their friends. I'm interviewing documentary makers who have turned wildlife documentaries from being a kind of a tanking topic in the 90s into what became Blue Planet and that kind of thing. Just had a fascinating conversation last week with a talent wrangler, as it were, and producer on reality TV shows, whose job is to make the contestants interesting, something that the audience connects with in 90 seconds. And I'm just thinking, well, perhaps it's time we actually looked more broadly outside our discipline and learned from people who are really good at this, and see how can we, to your point about that more transformative kind of global reappraisal, how can we actually make everything we do much more interesting to the people that we really need to engage? And I just really not happy to accept that this whole, because I think planners in particular talk about, there's a lot of talking down of people really aren't interested in brands, just get over yourselves, let's just not accept that. Let's just not accept that. Let's actually make ourselves more interesting.
I love that thought, and I'm looking forward to seeing the outputs of that project. I'm sure it'll be fascinating. But in the meantime, unfortunately, we're out of time. But my thanks to Adam Morgan for a fantastic session and really interesting answers to the questions there. So thank you, Adam.
Really enjoyed it. Thanks very much.
Brilliant. And thank you to the audience. Thanks for watching and listening. And just a reminder to subscribe and to share if you like this episode. And do look out for future episodes of Think with Google Fast Starters. So thank you very much.